It's June 28, 1919. World War I officially ends on paper. But in reality, it marks the beginning of a different kind of collapse. Germany was forced to accept full responsibility for the war. Millions dead across Europe, all laid at the feet of one defeated nation. The punishment followed quickly. Massive financial reparations were imposed, some so large that even economists at the time warned they were unrealistic. Territory that had been German for generations was stripped away and handed to neighboring states. The military was reduced to such a degree that Germany could no longer defend itself in any meaningful sense. Its army was capped, its navy dismantled, its air force banned entirely. Germany was not just defeated. It was rendered powerless. For millions of Germans, the deepest wound was not military loss. It was humiliation. They had not seen their armies collapse in the field. They had not watched foreign troops march triumphantly through Berlin. Instead, they were told they had lost because they were betrayed by politicians, by elites, by men who signed papers while soldiers bled. This belief, whether true or not, took root quickly, and then the economy began to collapse. Inflation spiraled out of control. Money lost value by the week, then by the day. Life savings evaporated overnight. Middle-class families who had lived comfortably suddenly couldn't afford bread. Food became scarce. Unemployment surged. Homelessness rose sharply in cities already struggling to recover from war. Veterans returned home injured, traumatized, and unemployed. Men who had survived the trenches only to find that the country they fought for no longer had a place for them. Banks raised interest rates as instability grew. Loans became impossible to repay. Businesses failed. Trust in institutions collapsed. For years, this pressure continued. Not a single crisis, but a long, grinding depression that wore people down psychologically as much as financially. People didn't just feel poor, they felt abandoned. At the same time, German society was changing fast. In major cities like Berlin, new cultural movements began to appear. Sexual research institutes opened. Public discussions about gender, sexuality, and identity entered newspapers, books, and academic circles. Clinics and organizations focused on sexuality and gender existed openly, something almost unheard of in earlier decades. To many, these changes felt unfamiliar, confusing, and deeply unsettling. To a population already struggling with hunger, unemployment, and loss of national pride, everything seemed to be changing at once. And when people reach that point, when pride, stability, and identity are stripped away, they begin searching for explanations. Into that void stepped a man whose own life had been shattered by the same war. A veteran, an angry, disillusioned former soldier. A man imprisoned after political violence, with no career, no family, no future waiting for him, no platform, no power, no influence, only resentment. And the only way he could express it was through ink and paper. So, from his own life story to his belief that he had found solutions to all of Germany's problems, everything he carried with him ended up inside that book. Every memory, every resentment, every explanation he had built to justify his failures and Germany's defeat was written down. The book became a place where personal biography and political ideology merged into a single narrative. His struggle became Germany's struggle. His anger became national anger. His explanations became answers. After his release from prison, the book was published with the help of party supporters and associates. At first, it did not dominate bookstores or capture widespread attention. But as Germany continued to suffer through economic hardship, political instability, and social change, the book slowly began to circulate. Sale after sale, it reached people who were no longer interested in complex debates. They wanted clarity, they wanted certainty. And the book provided exactly that. As Hitler's political profile grew, so did the reach of Mein Kampf. It was translated into multiple languages, not because the world admired it, but because journalists, diplomats, and political observers wanted to understand the man who was gaining influence in Germany. Inside the country, however, the reaction was very different. For many Germans who had lived through defeat, unemployment, and humiliation, the book felt like something more than political writing. It offered a story that explained why their lives had collapsed and promised that decline could be reversed. To supporters, the book represented hope after years of despair. Not hope based on compromise or recovery, but hope built on certainty and direction. It told readers that Germany's suffering was not meaningless and that a better future was possible if the nation followed the right path. Over time, among devoted followers, the book stopped being treated as an argument and began to be treated symbolically. Some supporters referred to it as a guiding text, even calling it the New Bible. As this belief spread, Hitler's public image changed. He was no longer seen by supporters as a failed veteran or fringe agitator. He was increasingly viewed as a figure of destiny, someone who had identified the source of Germany's problems and claimed to know how to fix them. His speeches drew larger crowds, his movement gained momentum, and with popularity came legitimacy. Financial support followed. Wealthy industrialists, business owners, and political sympathizers within Germany began providing funding to the Nazi Party, not always out of ideological loyalty, but because they believed Hitler could restore order, protect their interests, and stop the spread of communism. These financial contributions helped transform the party from a struggling movement into a well-organized political force capable of campaigning nationwide. This support did not come from the world at large, and it did not come from democratic leaders abroad. It came from individuals and institutions who believed they could benefit from Hitler's rise or control it. They underestimated both the ideology and the man behind it. By the early 1930s, Adolf Hitler was no longer just a writer, a speaker, or a political outsider. Through belief, funding, propaganda, and timing, he had become a central figure in German political life. To supporters, he appeared as a symbol of national revival. To opponents, he was a warning. And to many who stood in between, he seemed like the only figure offering answers in a country that felt completely lost. What followed was not the sudden seizure of power, but something far more dangerous. The slow normalization of belief, the steady transfer of trust, and the quiet acceptance of authority, all built on ideas that had once existed only on paper. After years of standing still, people began moving again. Men who had been unemployed for what felt like forever suddenly had jobs. Roads were being built, buildings were going up, factories were alive again. Every morning, people woke up with a purpose. Homelessness was no more as housing expanded. Families that had been crushed by inflation and debt felt the pressure ease. The government took control of the banks and pushed money directly into everyday life. Loans were made zero interest for families. You could borrow without feeling like the bank was waiting to ruin you. Parents could finally raise their kids without constant fear, without asking themselves how long the bread would last, without lying awake at night worrying about the next bill. For people who had lived through hunger, that feeling was everything, and people talked. They didn't talk about ideology. They didn't talk about long-term consequences. They talked about relief. They said he gave us work. They said he gave us dignity back. They said, after all those years of humiliation, he made us feel German again. That feeling spread fast. Loyalty didn't come from speeches. It came from full tables and steady pay. From the simple fact that life felt manageable again. To many Germans, Hitler wasn't a politician anymore. He was their hero. But this is where the story turns dark, because none of this was free. Germany didn't suddenly become wealthy. The recovery was held together by control, debt, and momentum. The state borrowed heavily, delayed repayment, and kept the economy moving by never letting it slow down. Rearmament consumed enormous resources. Accounts were adjusted. Problems were pushed forward instead of solved. Most people never saw that part. What they didn't realize was that Germany still lacked what it needed to survive. It lacked oil. It lacked raw materials. It lacked food security. And the money that had been borrowed, directly and indirectly, still had to be dealt with. If those debts were paid honestly, everything would collapse. Jobs would disappear. Loans would vanish. Fear would return overnight. The same people who now felt safe would be right back where they started, only worse. And this is where most people misunderstand what happened next. They think the war began purely because of hatred, because of ideology, because of Jews. That hatred existed, and it mattered. But it was not the full reason Germany went to war. There was something more basic underneath it. Every human understands this. When you take a loan, you pay it back. And if you can't pay it back, there are consequences. Germany couldn't pay back a single cent without destroying the system that had just made people loyal again. So repayment wasn't an option. The only way forward was expansion. War became the only solution. When Germany invaded Poland, it wasn't presented to the public as madness or conquest. It was framed as necessity, as survival, as taking what was needed to keep everything from falling apart. Land, food, labor, and resources could be taken without repayment. Pressure inside the system could be released outward. In that sense, war didn't begin as chaos. It began as a way to avoid collapse. And once that choice was made, there was no turning back. The same recovery that had created loyalty now depended on conflict to survive. Stability had been built on something that could only continue through expansion and violence. And after that successful invasion of Poland, we all know what came next. What had been presented as a single move didn't stop there. It spread. Alliances were pulled in. Borders collapsed. Within a short time, the world was no longer watching a conflict grow. It was living inside it. Entire nations were mobilized. Cities became targets. Industry, science, and manpower were all turned toward one purpose: destruction. People were dying faster than new lives were being born. Deaths became so large they stopped feeling human and started appearing as statistics. For the first time, people seriously feared extinction, not of one country, but of entire populations. The idea that civilization itself could end no longer felt impossible. This was the kind of war that didn't just change borders. It threatened everything. And yet, from every side, the story sounded the same. Every side believed they were fighting defensively. Every leader claimed necessity. Every nation blamed the one in front of them. Each justified their actions by pointing at the other side. So in reality, there is no simple answer to the hardest question in history. Is Adolf Hitler to blame? Because every side believed it was reacting. Every leader said they had no choice. And when everyone claims necessity, blame stops being clear and it spreads across time. And when blame spreads across time, it doesn't disappear. It carries forward. But what reaches the next generations is never the full story. It arrives in pieces and fragments. After the war, Germany was left broken in ways that couldn't be rebuilt with bricks. There was shame, silence, and a long period of reflection. Pride became something dangerous. History became something to handle carefully. For decades, the message was simple: never let this happen again. But as time passed, memory softened. The pain belonged to grandparents, then to history books. And while the past faded, new pressures began to build. Today, many young people are growing up in a world that feels unstable in a different way. The cost of living rises faster than opportunity. Debt follows people before they have even begun their adult lives. Loans feel unavoidable, but repayment feels endless. The future feels delayed, expensive, and out of reach. At the same time, society feels loud and divided. Cultural arguments dominate the conversation, while deeper economic fears remain unresolved. Many feel that their history is spoken about only in terms of guilt, not understanding. They feel judged, talked over, and rarely listened to. Men and women feel increasingly disconnected, unsure of their place, unsure of each other, unsure of what is expected anymore. For some, it feels like everything is changing at once, and none of it feels stable. When people grow up inside that kind of pressure, they don't search for complexity. They search for something solid, something that promises order, something that claims to have clear answers in a world full of noise. But all of this begins to feel familiar to history, and slowly, it starts to echo. Not because Gen Z understands Adolf Hitler, not because they want the past to return, but because they recognize the conditions that once made figures like him feel powerful. The promise of order after chaos, clarity after confusion, authority after instability. Hitler doesn't return as a leader in this generation. He returns as an image, as a symbol, as a reaction, stripped of context, stripped of consequence, turned into shock value or rebellion in a world that feels broken and unresponsive. That is why history becomes dangerous when it survives only in fragments, because when the lessons disappear, only the symbols remain. And history doesn't repeat itself because people admire the past. It repeats itself because people fail to recognize patterns while they are living inside them. That is why this story still matters. Not to defend what happened, not to erase it, but to understand it before the same pressures, the same confusion, and the same mistakes return under different names.